It's a pleasure to be here, and I think one of the things that has been enlightening for me is that all of the public events that I have been to have started off with acknowledging the land, the Aboriginal people and indigenous people, as well as their ancestors. And it's been powerful for me because in the United States, that's a recognition and acknowledgement that is very rarely brought to the fore. And so it's really been gratifying for me that all of the meetings have started off in that way. And so I would just like to add my acknowledgement as well before getting into this. I think it's a very powerful way to start all of these sessions. I want to talk to you a little bit this morning about the journey that we have been on at the San Francisco Foundation. As was mentioned, about 2 years ago, we launched a very ambitious new agenda that's focused in on, I think, responding to the issue of the day in the place where we live and work in the Bay Area, which is the fact that there's all kinds of economic growth and opportunity that's being generated in our region, but access to it is limited. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what that's meant for us, how we've been trying to respond to that issue, and how it's changed us as an organization. And if I have time, share with you some of the things that we have learned on that journey as well. But before doing that, I do want to kind of give you a little bit of context, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time, but I want you to understand who the San Francisco Foundation is, because it's an important part of the journey that we've been on. I also want to tell you a little bit about myself. We're not as old as the charitable foundation, Lord Mayor's. We are 70 years old this year. We were founded in 1948. And we were founded by a group of very civic-minded corporate leaders, led by an organization, a gentleman named Daniel Koshland. Daniel Koshland was the CEO of the Levi Strauss Corporation at the time. One of the people in our midst is the granddaughter of Daniel Koshland, Ellen Koshland. She's here. And so it's great to have her here as well. But I mention that because Daniel Koshland and his friends that established the San Francisco Foundation were very social justice oriented. Daniel Koshland was one of the people in the corporate community that organized the corporate community at the time to provide job opportunities for refugees associated with World War II. And it was engaged in all kinds of other civic activities that had that kind of orientation. So kind of social and economic justice focused in on the place of the Bay Area is very much a part of the DNA of the San Francisco Foundation, and that's a very important part of our journey. The second thing that's really important to know about our institution is that while it's called the San Francisco Foundation, we actually have a footprint in the Bay Area that's regional in nature. So we are in San Francisco County and Marin County and San Mateo County. For those who don't know the region well, those are counties that are on the coast of the Bay Area. And then inland, we are in two counties, Alameda and Contra Costa County. And so cumulatively, we represent an area that is home to about 4.3 million people. And those 4.3 million people, we did a study recently of our region in relationship to other regions in the country. Those 4.3 million people represent the second most diverse region in the country in the United States. 58% of the people in our region are people of color, African American, Asian, Latino. And so we have a very rich area in terms of our diversity and our demographics. At the same time, when we look at ourselves in relationship to other regions in the country, we are also the place that is grappling the most with the kind of income and wealth inequality that really is something that challenges the whole country as well. We're probably in the top 10 when it comes to that as well. So we had this unique combination of being the most diverse and the most inequitable in terms of the way that we are positioned. And that has created both a set of opportunities and challenges for us as a foundation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The other thing that you need to know about the San Francisco Foundation is we are made up both of endowed funds. We mentioned that it's about $1.3 billion in assets that we have under management. $800 million of that is endowment. The other portion of that is $500 million in donor-advised funds, representing 600 different funds with 900 different individuals. And so that's the business model. And so that's just kind of a snapshot. There's a lot more to learn about us, but I think that gives you a little bit of background. Just a little bit about me. I mentioned yesterday that I grew up in a family of people that have always been engaged in social and economic justice. I grew up in Oakland in a family of people who were nonprofit professionals, teachers, social workers, and the like. And I said yesterday that I am that kid that you always hear about, or you've often probably seen, who's in the back of the room with the coloring book, wondering why everyone is so upset and when we can go home. And so that was a very important part of my DNA. I was exposed to economic and social justice at a very early age. But that was my mother's side of the family, basically. My father's side of the family was different. My grandfather never graduated from middle school. He grew up in the South in the United States. As soon as he had the opportunity, he moved away, and he moved to Harlem in New York. Anybody been to New York? You'll appreciate this then. My grandfather told me two things. He owned a bar and grill around the corner from the Apollo Theater in Harlem. And he said to me, he said these things all the time. One was, when you leave New York, you're not going anywhere. And then the other thing that he told me is that if it's not a Cadillac, it's not a car. And the reason I bring that up a lot is because what that meant to me was that my grandfather had this immense connection to Harlem and New York in place. And so really my journey has been about the combination of the economic and social justice kind of activities that were associated with my mother's side of the family, but the real attachment to place that was associated with my grandfather. And so I often talk about the fact that I've had a number of positions, but really only one job. And that job was to work at the intersection of economic justice, social justice, and place. And that's really what our journey and our story is about. I'm not going to talk a little bit about the planning that went into our work, but there was a lot of it. And I talked a little bit about it yesterday. But 2 years ago, we established a North Star at the San Francisco Foundation that we think is very responsive to the conditions that we were experiencing in our community. And that North Star is to create a greater degree of racial and economic inclusion at a regional level of scale in the Bay Area. And I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about elements of that North Star. The first is this notion of equity. We talk about it a lot. I have a friend who says that equity is the new coconut water, where you hear a lot of people talking about it, but you rarely see people actually drinking it. So I want to give you a definition of equity. Equity is just and fair inclusion in a society where all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. We think that that is a very important definition for a couple of reasons. One is that it really highlights the fact that in order to achieve equity, you need to have a focus on the most vulnerable. But that focus on the most vulnerable doesn't mean that that's to the exclusion of everybody else. And to the contrary, we think that focusing on the most vulnerable among us and making sure that they can reach their full potential has benefits for everyone. The perfect example of that, which my mother has written about a lot, is called the curb cut theory. Who here is familiar with curb cuts? Curb cuts, you are familiar with it. When I explain it to you, you'll say, oh yeah. Curb cuts, when you're walking around the street and you see a curb cut, that means that the curb has gone down to the ground and you can easily access the sidewalk. Curb cuts came from the advocacy on behalf of people with mobile disabilities, so that those folks would have the same kind of access to the streets and sidewalks that everybody else had. It's a perfect example of an approach or a strategy that benefits the most vulnerable, benefiting us all. Now, why do I say that? When you look at the curb cuts today, and if you just stand on the side and look at who's using them, what you will see is the catering service with their carts going from one event to the other using the curb cuts. What you'll see is the lawyer with their briefs in their suitcase using the curb cut so that they can get to their meeting. You'll see the young woman with the baby carriage using the curb cuts. Curb cuts are the perfect example of advocacy on behalf of the most vulnerable, meeting the needs of everyone. I often talk about the fact that if you take that theory and you apply it to the things that we're working on, it also applies. If you take a police department, for example, a police department that acknowledges that Black lives matter, I guarantee you is a police department that treats everybody with the kind of dignity and respect that they deserve. A school that can meet the needs of the most vulnerable young people in the classroom, those are usually folks who have some kind of learning disability. I guarantee you a school that figures out how to make sure that a young person with a learning disability is able to succeed is the kind of school that makes sure that everybody can succeed in that school district. So the curb cut theory, I think, is a perfect description of how you meet the needs of the most vulnerable, everybody benefits, and that is the major concept when it comes to what is equity and what are we trying to achieve. Everybody reaching their full potential. So what has this meant for us? We used to be organized around issue areas at the San Francisco Foundation. Issue areas like community development, community health, education, arts and culture, the environment. And we still think about those areas and we still work on those areas, but we now think about them in a very different way. We think about them in relationship to how we can use them to achieve equity. And so we have moved away from organizing around issue areas, and we have moved towards organizing ourselves around what we characterize as the pathways to equity. And those are the concepts of people, place, and power. I want to spend a little bit of time unpacking those. With people, we have created a whole new area of work called expanding access to opportunity. And what that work is really about is primarily lifting the floor and improving working conditions for low-wage workers so that there's less distance between the haves and the have-nots. But just as equally as important, we're focused in on making sure that there's economic mobility so that people have the ability to move from the lower rungs of the economic ladder to the upper rungs of the economic ladder. That's principally what that work is about. But underneath it, one of the major things that we're working on is removing systemic barriers to opportunity, involvement in the criminal justice system, uneven access to high-quality education. Those kinds of things, those kinds of systemic things that are barriers to economic opportunity, your status as a refugee or an immigrant in the United States and what that means to you in terms of access to opportunity. We're focused in on all those kinds of things under expanding access to opportunity. Under place, we created a body of work called Anchoring Communities, which is really about the recognition that where you live can either be a springboard to opportunity or a sister to the lack thereof. And we want to make sure that everybody lives in a place that's a springboard. So we're thinking about how housing interrelates in terms of access to opportunity, affordable housing, anti-displacement, and those kinds of things to make sure that people have an anchor for them to stay. We also, in this body of work, which is very fascinating, interesting, exciting to me, is we focus a lot on arts and culture. And arts and culture in relationship to placemaking and place identity, and thinking about how arts really identify place and how we make sure that not only are people not being displaced from their homes in these communities, but there also isn't cultural displacement from these communities. So we think a lot about that work. Under power, we create a body of work called Nurturing Equity Movements. And I think the best way for me to characterize the work there is that what we are trying to do is amplify and bring to higher relief the civic voice of low-income communities and communities of color. And we're doing that for a couple of reasons. One is we believe very firmly that we can have all the great ideas under people in place that we want. But if those ideas are not connected to an authentic constituency of people who are demanding the kinds of changes and improvements that we're talking about, then what we're doing and the ideas that we have won't reach the level of scale that's needed in order to have the kind of impact we have, and it won't be sustainable. So the Nurturing Equity Movements work is about both connecting constituency to the great ideas that are coming out of the other areas of work, but it's also about recognizing that the work of civic engagement and civic participation is a very important body of work in and of itself. So there are aspects of it that aren't even connected to the other work that we're talking about. In this area of work, we're supporting community organizing, advocacy, leadership development, those kinds of things, really nurturing that body of work. And so those are the areas that we're focused in on. This is a very different approach for us. This idea of having a North Star that cascades down throughout the entire organization and drives everything that we do is very different. And this notion of having these areas of work is different, and I'll explain a little bit why it's different. We're obviously a grant-making institution at our core. But if you'll notice, I'm not calling these grant-making areas, I'm calling them areas of work. And the reason for that is because grant-making, we think, is one tool in our tool belt to achieve the kinds of things that we're trying to achieve. And that if we're really operating on all cylinders, we're using our grant-making, we're leveraging our relationships, we're able to capture the attention of donors who are at the San Francisco Foundation, we're able to capture the attention of other donors and philanthropic institutions in our midst to try to convince them to be partners in this work. And increasingly, we are thinking about how to align our investment strategy with our endowment, with our mission. And so we are making loans from our endowment. We are also in the process of establishing a mission-related investment portfolio where we're actually going to be able to make equity-oriented investments in corporations that are aligned with our mission as well. And so we think about this work in those ways. I want to talk about a little how other areas have changed for our grant making. We used to have an approach where in order to figure out how to get a grant from the San Francisco Foundation, you really had to wrap yourself into pretzels to figure out where you fit. Do you fit in the community development area? Do you fit in the community health area? Do you fit into the education area? And what we've done is we've gotten rid of that, and what we do now is we ask people who are looking or seeking funds from the foundation to just tell us what you're doing. Tell us why you think it fits with the equity agenda. Tell us about the kind of results that you're achieving in your community. You submit that to us, and we figure out where you fit. And so that's a very different approach for us. Another thing that's different is that we used to have what I characterize as the peanut butter spread approach to philanthropy, which means everybody got a little bit. Our average grant size was about $15,000. The average term was about 12 months. There were a lot of people that were satisfied with that because there were a lot of folks who actually received a grant from us. But very few people received a grant from us that was substantial enough or long-term enough to actually make a difference in their community. And so we have changed that format, and now the average grant at the foundation is about $75,000 to $80,000. The average term is about 2 to 3 years. We think that that gets us much closer to making the kinds of grants that allow our partners to succeed and achieve the kinds of things that they want to achieve. The other thing that's a little bit different for us is we think, again, not just about kind of how we use our own money, but we think a lot about how we can influence the spending of others around the areas that we're focused in on as well. And then the last thing that I would mention is that, well, the second to last thing, actually, I had to mention this. We have moved away from very categorical program support to general operating support, both because we think that that's the kind of support that our partners need, but also because they had been telling us that for years. And just one little funny anecdote about this, I told this story yesterday. We announced that 2 years ago, and when we announced it, nobody applied for general operating support. And I've come to the conclusion that it was because they just didn't believe us. That we had been providing program support for so long, they just didn't believe us when we said that we were ready to provide general operating support. So people are gradually moving there. But it's really been an interesting thing to watch. And then here's the last thing that I want to mention that's different. We have also concluded that programs and services are really important, especially programs and services that are delivered in high quality and at a level of scale that matters are really important. But at the same time, they're also insufficient. And what I mean by that is that if we think that we can just provide philanthropic support for programs and services and get to where we want to go, we're fooling ourselves. We think that the vast majority of the people that we're concerned about are interacting with public systems and operating in a policy environment that's dictated by public systems. And we think that if we're not trying to influence those public systems and influence the policies that really dictate how those systems operate, we're going to fall short of where we want to be. And so we now think about our work not only in terms of programs and services, but what can we learn from those programs and services to influence public policy and influence large public systems that interact with these families and these individuals on a much more frequent basis than we do. I want to give you one example of what it looks like at the foundation for us to be operating on all cylinders on this body of work. And that's the example of affordable housing. In our region, the average housing price nowadays is $1 million. And rents in the high demand parts of our region can get up to $4,000, $3,500 a month. People who we are talking about, who we're concerned about, who are low-income people of color, are particularly vulnerable in their housing situations. If you were to do a kind of windshield survey of the homelessness in Oakland or San Francisco or the Bay Area, what you would see is that the majority of the people that you see on the streets are people of color. And so we think that housing is actually one of the most important racial equity and economic inclusion issues of our day in the Bay Area. And for that reason, we are actually utilizing all the tools that I described to you to try to be responsive to this issue. We're making grants. We're making grants to nonprofit organizations that are developing affordable housing. We're making grants to advocacy groups who are engaging policymakers to make sure that those who are most vulnerable to losing their housing have policies in place that try to protect them, to make sure that they have access to legal aid, to make sure that they don't fall victim to rent gouging and inordinate amounts of rent increases and things like that. And so we're making grants. We're also making loans, I referred to before. We have a $5 million carve-out that we made of our endowment and that we asked donors at the San Francisco Foundation to match. So we have a $10 million program-related investment program that seeks a 3% rate of return. We're making loans to organizations that are acquiring land or engaging in pre-development activity to develop affordable housing, and so we're leveraging that part of the work that we do. We are bringing our own leadership to the work around housing. I am co-chairing a body that includes labor, elected officials, appointed officials, nonprofit housing developers, market rate housing developers, to develop a set of recommendations that we're going to take to the state legislature at the end of the year to address the regional housing issues in our region. We're developing new partnerships. We just developed a partnership with Facebook, the company, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and the Ford Foundation to also think about housing and transportation issues in the Bay Area. And we're using that partnership to develop a new fund to finance affordable housing production that we hope will be populated by the tech industry in the Bay Area to the tune of $500 million. And lastly, we're engaged in advocacy. We supported in November of 2016 polling in our community to see if voters in our community were willing to tax themselves in order to produce a public fund for affordable housing development. When that polling came in positive, we worked with legislative bodies in our region to get those initiatives on the ballot. We supported the Yes On campaigns once they were on the ballot, and the public education that was associated with people knowing what was on the ballot and how they should move. And the result was $2 billion worth of public dollars that were committed to affordable housing in the region, supported to the tune of about 70% of the folks who turned out at the polls. And what we would have spent for one unit of affordable housing in the Bay Area, $500 million, $500,000, I'm sorry. We actually were able to produce $2 billion worth of money to support affordable housing, literally thousands of units of the housing. So that kind of gives you a snapshot of what we're trying to do. So I want to talk to you in the time that I have left a little bit about what we've learned. The first thing that we've learned is that data is absolutely essential towards accomplishing what we want to achieve. I haven't talked a lot about kind of some of the stuff that the benchmarks and goals that we've kind of put out for ourselves in each one of these areas that maybe we could talk about a little bit later. But data is important. Data is important for us to understand the scope and complexity of the issue. Data is important to us to understand where the disparities exist, whether they're across race or class or gender or geography. But in order to understand as well whether or not we're moving the needle on the issues that we want to move the needle on. But in order to do that, not only do we have to have data that kind of gives us the aggregated picture of what's happening in our community, we need data disaggregated by race, by geography, by gender. And so that's a very important lesson for us. Data disaggregated along the lines that we need to know where to focus and whether or not we're making a difference is really key. The second thing that has been really an important learning for us is, I didn't talk a lot about our process, but we held community meetings, we invited experts into the foundation, we had focus groups with donors, I was having monthly meetings with staff, meetings with other stakeholders. We communicated a lot, and at the same time, we did not communicate enough about what we were doing. So investing in the volume of communication that's important, but very strategic communication around this issue is key, because the other kind of sub thing that we've learned here is that we're talking about race and class and power. Race and class and power, I don't know about here, but where I'm from, those are issues that people do not run into the room to talk about. And so thinking about how we can simultaneously be the truth tellers, be bold about this agenda, make sure that people understand that race and class should not be proxies for opportunity is a very important thing to do, but we've got to be able to do that in ways that are still inviting and don't alienate significant parts of the population. So it both has to be a kind of bold and somewhat cutting edge commentary, but it has to be an inviting commentary. And thinking about how you do that is very important. It's a needle that we're trying to thread, and I would say, frankly, we haven't gotten it right yet. The other thing, and I mentioned this before, programs and services, important but insufficient. We also have to engage in advocacy. We've learned that, and I've told you some of the lessons there. Another lesson, though, is that people call it different things. People call it collective impact. People call it collaboration. People call it partnership development. There's a term that's being used a lot now called intersectionality. Whatever you call it, we've got to realize that one community's gain is not another community's setback. And in order for us to achieve what we're trying to achieve, we've got to be able to do it together. We've got to be able to work across sectors. We've got to be able to work across racial and ethnic groups. We've got to be able to work across classes if we have any hope of trying to achieve what we're trying to do. I mentioned this yesterday, but it's worth repeating. My mom often tells me, if you have come up with a solution to a complex problem that only involves yourself, you either don't understand the problem or have the wrong solution. And that's just something that I think is really important to keep in mind. The last thing, in order to be successful around an agenda around inclusion and equity, we have got to keep the people who we intend to benefit from this work at the center of the work. Their stories have to be grounding for all the solutions. They need to be involved in design and decision-making around the things that we're trying to do. They need to be involved in governance. Who knows better what the solutions are for their communities, for their families, than the families and the people who live in those communities themselves? We have to remember that is one of the most important ingredients, we think, to success. And so I'll end there. But really, I just want to thank you for your time. Again, we've been on this journey for a couple of years. We think we're doing the right work at the right time, but we're still learning as we're going. And it's really great to be able to share what we're doing and being able to strategize and learn with a group of folks who are struggling with the same issues as well. So thank you.